Something begins to realign within you even before anything changes on the outside. And this is not emotion, it's alignment. You did not arrive here out of curiosity. You arrived because there is an invisible point where heaven touches a person's path, and when that point is activated, nothing remains in the same place. I declare now that your spiritual perception is opening, not to create unrealistic expectations, but to recognize what was already in motion while you thought everything was standing still. I decree that every sense of delay loses its power in this moment. Time ceases to be an enemy and becomes an ally. The rhythm of heaven begins to govern your steps. I affirm that you are not chasing something. You are being repositioned to meet what was already reserved for you. I declare that decisions that once felt confusing begin to align internally. The mind slows down, the spirit takes the lead. Anxiety loses its grip. I decree that every invisible barrier, emotional, mental, or spiritual, begins to give way now. Not by effort, but by authority. You are not trying to access something new. You are accessing what has always been yours, but required maturity to sustain. I affirm that your journey enters a phase of continuous clarity. You begin to recognize when to move forward, when to wait, and when to change course, without guilt. I decree that your spiritual identity is strengthened. You stop seeing yourself through what you lived and begin positioning yourself according to what you were called to live. Now, declare this as an act of alignment, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. I accept heaven's realignment over my life. This is positioning. I declare that everything that was built within you during seasons of silence now begins to find expression. What once seemed invisible starts to produce response. I decree that no process was in vain. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was delayed without purpose. I affirm that you did not lose time, you gained structure. I declare that every experience that once felt confusing now begins to make sense. Loose pieces connect, broken stories reorganize, directions align. I decree that the fear of making mistakes loses its power over your decisions. You begin to decide with conviction, not insecurity. I affirm that your spiritual energy stabilizes. You no longer swing between faith and doubt. You walk with consistency. I declare that aligned opportunities begin to recognize you, not by insistence, but by spiritual compatibility. I decree that environments that once did not respond begin to open. Doors that did not react now acknowledge your presence. I affirm that you enter a phase where you no longer need to prove yourself. Your posture speaks for you. Your alignment opens paths. I declare that comparison loses its power. You do not need to compete. You need to occupy. I decree that vision expands. You see beyond the immediate, beyond the visible, beyond the obvious. And if this environment is resonating with you, subscribe to the channel, not as an automatic gesture, but as a conscious decision to remain in a space that sustains growth, clarity, and continuous spiritual advancement. There is a point in the journey where life stops responding to effort and begins responding to alignment. That point is not visible, but it is decisive. I declare that you are crossing that point now, not because you did everything right, but because you reached the level of awareness required to sustain the next access. I decree that your life will no longer be governed by repeated attempts. You enter a phase where every step carries intention, direction, and response. I affirm that what once required constant strain now begins to flow with clarity. You no longer push doors. You recognize the ones that were already prepared to open. I declare that heaven adjusts your route without confusion, without noise, without loss of identity. I decree that internal decisions begin to settle. You stop negotiating with fear. You stop postponing what must be assumed. You stop waiting for external validation to move forward. I affirm that your perception matures. You begin to identify distractions before you get involved. You recognize what is strategic before it becomes obvious. I declare that your time comes into order. Not clock time, but response time. Harvest time. The time of the right encounter. I decree that what was fragmented within you begins to organize. Parts that once did not communicate enter coherence. Vision, emotion, and action begin to walk together. I affirm that you no longer live in spiritual survival mode. You begin to operate with territorial awareness, positional awareness, quiet authority. I declare that environments begin to respond to your presence, not because you force them, but because you carry alignment. What was invisible begins to become recognizable, not through exposure, but through maturity. There are movements that do not begin on the outside. They begin when something internal stabilizes. I decree that this is your moment of deep stabilization, not merely emotional, but spiritual, structural, and identity level. I affirm that you are no longer a prisoner of internal fluctuations. You do not advance one day and retreat the next. You become established. I declare that heaven sets a solid foundation beneath your feet. Even if the external scenario is still in transition, you do not lose balance. I decree that clarity replaces noise. The excess of thoughts dissolves. Confusion loses strength. Direction asserts itself with gentleness. I affirm that you begin to walk with quiet conviction, without haste, without comparison, without the need to prove anything. I declare that what was being prepared in silence now finds the support required to manifest. Nothing premature, nothing out of season. I decree that you begin to recognize when something is not for you, and it no longer hurts. You release without guilt. You close cycles without fear. You move forward without carrying weight. I affirm that your life enters a phase of conscious choices. You choose where to invest your energy. You choose who to walk with. You choose what to sustain. I declare that your authority grows from the inside out. It is not imposed, it is perceived. I decree that what tried to confuse you loses ground, and what was waiting for alignment begins to draw near. You do not need to run. What is yours knows how to find you. There is a kind of growth that is not immediately noticed because it happens first along the inner axis. When that axis is adjusted, everything around it begins to respond without effort. I declare that your inner axis is being recalibrated now, not to turn you into someone different, but to align you with who you were always destined to be. I decree that you no longer react to external stimuli the way you once did. Situations that used to pull you off center now pass without impact. People who once disorganized you lose influence. Environments that drained your energy no longer have access. I affirm that your strength no longer comes from resistance, but from stability. You do not need to fight constantly to remain standing. You remain standing because you are established. I declare that your spiritual awareness deepens. You begin to perceive nuances. You understand subtle signals. You recognize direction before it becomes obvious to others. I decree that you begin to move with precision. Fewer steps, greater results. Less wear, more clarity. Less noise, more response. I affirm that what once felt confusing begins to organize internally. You no longer need to understand everything in order to trust. You trust because you recognize alignment. I declare that your journey enters its own rhythm. You do not accelerate to keep up with anyone. You do not slow down to fit into small environments. You walk in your own time, and that time is respected. I decree that your presence begins to generate silent impact. You enter, and something shifts. You speak, and something adjusts. You decide, and something moves. Nothing forced, nothing artificial, nothing built on anxiety. What is being born now is sustained. There is a moment when heaven does not only direct, it confirms. And that confirmation does not come as applause, but as settled peace. I declare that you begin to recognize internal confirmations that do not depend on external signs. You know when something is yours. You know when it is time to move forward. You know when it is time to close the cycle. I decree that doubt loses authority over your choices. You no longer decide based on the fear of making mistakes. You decide from the conviction of being aligned. I affirm that your path becomes progressively clearer. Not all at once, but enough for the next step. And that is enough. I declare that heaven removes the need for excessive control. You release the attempt to predict everything. You release the burden of anticipating outcomes. You trust the process without disconnecting from action. I decree that your spiritual maturity is revealed in the small decisions, in how you react, in how you respond, in how you choose to remain at peace. I affirm that you enter a phase where advancement does not come with noise. It comes with consistency. It comes with stability. It comes with sustainability. I declare that what was being prepared behind the scenes now finds solid ground within you. And because of that, it is not lost. It does not break. It does not drift. I decree that you do not return to former versions of yourself. Even when pressured, even when tested, even when provoked, you move forward with awareness. What comes next does not require haste. It requires presence. And you are present. There is a kind of advancement that does not happen because circumstances improve, but because you change on the inside. And when that happens, the environment begins to respond differently, even if nothing around you has visibly changed yet. I declare that you are entering this kind of advancement now. An advancement that does not depend on external permission. An advancement that does not ask for validation. an advancement that happens because you have become compatible with it. I decree that your life is no longer governed by repeated attempts. You stop going in circles trying to get it right. You begin to move with clear intention, even without having all the answers. I affirm that something within you becomes non-negotiable. You no longer shrink to fit. You no longer explain yourself to be accepted. You no longer fragment yourself to please others. I declare that heaven strengthens your internal posture, and when posture changes, the path adjusts. I decree that opportunities begin to align with who you are now, not with who you used to be. That is why some old doors no longer make sense. And that is not loss, it is refinement. I affirm that you begin to recognize when something no longer belongs on your path without inner conflict. You release with maturity. You move forward with lightness. You continue with awareness. I declare that your spiritual perception deepens. You sense when something is out of season. You recognize when something is aligned. You feel when it is time to act, and when it is time to stand firm. I decree that you begin to walk with silent authority, not the kind that imposes, the kind that sustains. Now, as a sign of internal alignment, write in the comments, "Not for me, but for yourself." I move with clarity and sustain what I am accessing. This is not ordinary interaction. It is a recorded decision. There is a difference between being in motion and being in direction. Many are moving. Few truly know where they are going. I declare that you are entering direction now. Not a generic direction, but a specific route, aligned with your calling, your timing, and your capacity to sustain what is coming. I decree that your energy is no longer scattered. You stop fragmenting yourself trying to do everything at once. You become focused, and where there is focus, there is expansion. I affirm that your mind begins to operate on another level of clarity. Repetitive thoughts lose their grip. Internal noise fades. Vision organizes itself. I declare that heaven repositions your priorities. You begin to invest your energy in what produces real fruit. You release what only consumes time, emotion, and strength. I decree that you become strategically patient, not passive, not complacent, but aware that everything solid requires a firm foundation. I affirm that you begin to recognize the value of the process without losing yourself inside it. You learn as you walk. You grow as you advance. And you do not abandon the journey halfway through. I declare that your path enters coherence. What you think, feel, and do begins to point in the same direction. And when that happens, progress becomes inevitable. I decree that environments that once overlooked you begin to respond, not through forced exposure, but because your presence carries consistency. You do not need to announce yourself. Alignment speaks for you. And what comes next recognizes who you have become. There are moments when life no longer asks for adjustments. It asks for an internal decision. Not an impulsive decision, but one that reorganizes priorities, energy, and focus all at once. I declare that you are entering this level of decision now. A decision not born from external pressure, but from internal maturity. I decree that you stop postponing what you already understand. You no longer delay what your spirit has already recognized as necessary. You take responsibility for the next step. I affirm that your energy begins to align with your choices. You no longer say yes with your body and no with your spirit. You walk whole. I declare that heaven honors mature decisions. And when a decision is honored, it produces sustenance, not exhaustion. I decree that you begin to clearly discern the cost of remaining where you are. And this moves you, not by fear, but by vision. I affirm that your mind enters a state of deep organization. You no longer carry weights that are not yours. You no longer assume responsibilities that do not belong to you. You position yourself with clarity. I declare that your life begins to respond to this new level of alignment. Answers arrive. Solutions emerge. Paths become defined. I decree that you stop living in reaction mode. You begin to live in direction mode. And direction produces stability. What once felt scattered begins to concentrate. What once felt confusing begins to clarify. What once felt distant begins to draw near. There is a kind of advancement that doesn't happen because everything is ready, but because you are ready. And when you are ready, the environment adjusts along the way. I declare that you are entering this kind of advancement now, not waiting for perfect conditions, but trusting the foundation that has already been built within you. I decree that you stop negotiating with old versions of yourself. You no longer return to habits that no longer match who you've become. You no longer retreat to familiar zones just for comfort. I affirm that your spiritual identity becomes established. You no longer lose yourself trying to adapt. You remain firm, even when the environment tries to pull you backward. I declare that heaven strengthens your consistency. You do not begin energized and end exhausted. You begin aware, and you remain consistent. I decree that your life enters a more stable flow. Not the absence of challenges, but the presence of structure to move through them. I affirm that you learn to discern when something requires effort and when it requires release. You stop forcing what does not respond and invest in what grows with you. I declare that your walk gains depth. You no longer live from spiritual highs. You live from a firm foundation. I decree that everything that was being prepared within you now finds space to operate with maturity. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is lost. You are not late. You are ready. There comes a moment when advancement no longer comes from learning something new, but from fully owning what you already know. It is when understanding stops being intellectual and becomes embodied. I declare that you are entering that point now. A point where you stop negotiating with internal truths. A point where you stop postponing decisions that are already mature. I decree that your spiritual awareness expands in a practical way. You don't just understand, you apply. You don't just feel, you act. You don't just perceive, you take your position. I affirm that heaven begins to respond to your posture, not only to your prayers, because posture sustains what prayer activates. I declare that you no longer live internally divided. What you think, feel, and choose begins to move in the same direction, and that creates strength. I decree that every hesitation rooted in insecurity loses its place. You no longer need external guarantees to move forward. You advance because you recognize alignment. I affirm that your life enters a stage of greater spiritual responsibility, and responsibility is not weight, it is conscious authority. I declare that you begin to move like someone who understands the value of what they carry. You do not disperse. You do not undersell yourself. You do not get lost in distractions. I decree that your presence begins to generate impact even when you say nothing. The environment senses it. People perceive it. Situations adjust. And now, as an act of conscious alignment, write in the comments, I take responsibility for what heaven has placed within me. This is not an empty phrase. It is spiritual positioning. There is a kind of growth that only happens when you choose to remain. Not remaining out of fear of change, but out of awareness that you are in the right place to mature. I declare that you are entering this kind of permanence now. A permanence that strengthens, not stagnates. A permanence that builds foundation, not limitation. I decree that you stop seeking constant stimulation just to feel like you're moving. You learn to grow in depth, not only in intensity. I affirm that your faith becomes stable. It does not depend on emotional highs. It does not fluctuate with circumstances. It remains firm. I declare that heaven strengthens your consistency. You no longer start projects and abandon them halfway. You sustain processes until they become structure. I decree that your life begins to respond to this new level of maturity. What once felt fragile grows strong. What once oscillated becomes stable. I affirm that you learn to recognize when something requires time, not pressure. You honor the process without losing sight of the outcome. I declare that your journey gains solidity. You no longer build on impulse. You build on understanding. And if this content is helping you grow with clarity, subscribe to the channel. Not as an automatic habit, but as a conscious choice to walk within an environment that sustains real, deep, and lasting processes. Here, growth is not shallow. It is built. There is a silent transition that happens when you stop reacting to what occurs and begin responding from who you are. It is not visible to everyone, but it changes everything on the inside. I declare that this transition is happening in you now. You no longer live in emotional survival mode. You no longer react impulsively. You no longer move driven by anxiety. I decree that your identity begins to lead your decisions. You choose from conviction, not from lack. You position yourself from clarity, not from fear. I affirm that your mind begins to reorganize. Scattered thoughts come into alignment. Confusing ideas turn into direction. I declare that you begin to recognize when something is not for you, even when it looks good. And this perception spares you from delays that once consumed your time and energy. I decree that your spiritual sensitivity becomes more precise. You discern environments. You discern cycles. You discern people. I affirm that you no longer feel guilty for saying no to what does not sustain your advancement. You understand that maturity is also conscious refusal. I declare that your energy is no longer drained by external expectations. You do not need to prove anything. You simply sustain who you have become. I decree that heaven strengthens your inner stability. Even when the external landscape shifts, you remain whole. And this wholeness becomes your greatest distinction. There comes a point where growth no longer happens through external expansion, but through internal refinement. It is the moment when excess leaves and what is essential remains. I declare that you enter this refinement now. You do not need to carry everything. You do not need to please everyone. You do not need to be everywhere. I decree that your life enters a process of powerful simplification. Less noise, less dispersion, more focus. I affirm that what no longer serves you begins to lose strength naturally, without conflict, without exhaustion, without guilt. I declare that you learn to honor your own limits. And this does not diminish you, it strengthens you. I decree that heaven adjusts your rhythm, not too fast, not too slow, but at the exact pace needed to sustain what is coming. I affirm that you become more selective about what you allow into your mind and into your heart. And this discernment creates space for real growth. I declare that your vision deepens. You no longer look only at the final result. You understand the path. I decree that your maturity begins to attract opportunities compatible with who you are now, not with who you used to be. And this inner adjustment begins to prepare you for greater levels of responsibility, influence, and impact. There comes a moment when progress no longer requires extra effort. It requires absolute internal alignment. It is when you stop pushing doors and begin walking toward the ones already prepared to open. I declare that this alignment is being established within you now. You are no longer trying to convince the future to accept you. You are becoming compatible with it. I decree that your inner posture shifts. You no longer wait for external signs to move. You move because you know who you are. I affirm that your confidence no longer depends on validation. It is born from a quiet, firm, and non-negotiable conviction. I declare that decisions that once felt heavy now become clear. You sense when it is time to advance, and you sense when it is time to step back, without guilt. I decree that heaven removes the pressure of having to get everything right. You understand that walking in alignment is more important than walking fast. I affirm that your life begins to operate from internal coherence. What you think, feel, and do now move in the same direction. I declare that this state of coherence protects you from choices that would delay your purpose. And when coherence is established, the environment begins to respond. There is an authority that does not impose itself. It manifests. It does not come from the tone of your voice. It comes from the integrity between who you are and what you sustain. I declare that this authority begins to manifest in you now. You no longer need to over-explain. You no longer need to justify yourself. You no longer need to defend yourself all the time. I decree that your presence communicates security even before words are spoken. Rooms feel it when you arrive. Conversations shift levels when you participate. I affirm that heaven strengthens your spiritual identity in a visible way. What was once internal now begins to reflect externally. I declare that you occupy spaces naturally, without fear of failure, without fear of not being enough. I decree that comparison completely loses its power over you. You understand that your journey is unique, and that understanding sets you free. I affirm that your voice begins to carry weight, not through volume, but through truth. When you speak, something organizes. I declare that people begin to trust you without fully knowing why. It is authority that flows, not authority that is forced. And this quiet authority begins to prepare you for greater levels of influence, responsibility, and reach. There is a point where progress does not happen because something changed outside. It happens because you shifted positions on the inside. I declare that this inner shift is happening in you now. You are no longer trying to survive your days. You are beginning to govern the rhythm of your own life. I decree that everything that kept you bound to old patterns loses its power. Old reactions no longer control you. Old responses no longer define your next steps. I affirm that your mind becomes an organized territory. Confusion no longer finds room to remain. Excess noise is silenced. I declare that heaven repositions your perception. You begin to see opportunities where you once saw only exhaustion. You identify pathways that remain hidden from those who walk misaligned. I decree that your faith is no longer just resistance. It becomes active direction. I affirm that you recognize when something has ended without needing dramatic signs. And you recognize when something has begun, even while it is still invisible. I declare that this discernment protects you from unnecessary delays. You no longer insist where there is no flow, and you do not abandon what heaven is still working on. Now, as an act of alignment, without rush, without anxiety, write in the comments, "I align with the new season and walk in clarity." This is not ritual. It is positioning. When alignment happens, the environment begins to reorganize in silence. Nothing explodes immediately, but everything starts to move. I declare that invisible adjustments are taking place around you. Conversations, decisions, and movements are being prepared beyond your control and in your favor. I decree that heaven is working while you rest internally. You no longer carry the weight of having to fix everything on your own. I affirm that your spiritual energy stabilizes. You no longer live in extreme peaks. You live in consistency. I declare that this consistency makes you trustworthy to receive more influence, more resources, more responsibility. I decree that the right doors begin to respond naturally, without insistence, without weariness, without emotional negotiation. I affirm that your yes now carries weight, and your no begins to command respect. I declare that you enter a phase where less explanation is required. Things simply begin to happen. I decree that your life enters a state of continuous advancement, where progress no longer depends on excessive effort, but on constant alignment. And this prepares you for the next level. There comes a moment when you stop asking why, and begin to recognize for what purpose. That is the moment when spiritual maturity takes the lead. I declare that you are entering this turning point now. Nothing in you is late. Nothing was wasted. I decree that everything that once seemed disconnected begins to form meaning. Experiences that did not fit before now align like pieces of the same design. I affirm that you no longer need to prove who you are. Your presence already communicates. Your posture already announces. I declare that heaven removes from you the anxiety of comparison. You are no longer running on someone else's track. You are walking at the exact pace of what was written for you. I decree that this clarity brings inner rest, and that rest opens space for real expansion. You begin to notice that the less you force, the more things flow. And if this kind of content is helping you adjust your route, your mind, and your faith, it makes sense to keep walking together. Subscribe to the channel to remain in this atmosphere. It's not about the number of videos, it's about consistency of alignment. Now, something shifts to a new level. You are no longer just understanding, you are assuming. I declare that you take responsibility for what you carry. Gifts no longer dormant. Callings no longer postponed. I decree that you stop negotiating with fear. Decisions that were once delayed are now resolved with firmness. I affirm that heaven entrusts new territories to those who sustain inner clarity, and you are stepping into that trust. I declare that what you touch begins to respond differently, not because you changed your effort, but because you changed your awareness. I decree that your inner voice becomes clearer than external noise. Opinions lose strength. Direction takes priority. I affirm that you become someone difficult to destabilize, not through rigidity, but through conviction. I declare that this is the kind of maturity that sustains prosperity. Prosperity that remains. Prosperity that does not demand the soul as its price. And this is preparing you for something even deeper. There is a kind of strength that makes no noise. It does not announce itself. It establishes itself. I declare that this strength begins to operate in you now. It is not impulse. It is internal decision. I decree that you no longer live reacting to what happens. You begin to anticipate movements, choices, and doors. I affirm that heaven is refining your perception. You begin to recognize when something looks good, but is not aligned. And you choose alignment, even when it requires maturity. I declare that this awareness protects you from future losses. It frees you from unnecessary delays, and it preserves your energy for what truly matters. I decree that excess begins to fall away. Unnecessary explanations, connections without purpose, expectations that were never born in heaven. You no longer need to carry what is not yours. And now, as a conscious, not automatic act, declare, I choose to live aligned with what was written for me. Feel this with intention. There is a silence that precedes great advancement. It is not emptiness, it is concentration. I declare that you are entering the strategic silence now, where the spirit takes the lead and anxiety loses its place. I decree that you learn to wait without becoming paralyzed, to act without anxiety, to move forward without needing to prove anything. I affirm that heaven begins to entrust you with precise timing. You no longer arrive early or late. You arrive at the exact point. I declare that this spiritual precision changes outcomes. Conversations happen at the right moment. Opportunities appear when you are ready to sustain them. I decree that you no longer get lost trying to understand everything. You trust the process, and you walk with awareness. This is not passivity. It is mature authority. And now, all of this is preparing you for something even deeper. Not of words, but of access. Before we step into what comes next, there is an inner position that must be taken. Nothing happens without alignment. Nothing manifests without agreement. So do not receive this in silence. Declare it out loud, with intention, with awareness, with presence. I am aligned with what heaven has decided about me. I receive access to what has already been released. I release resistance, fear, and doubt. I step consciously into what is being activated now. Take a deep breath, because this declaration creates space. What comes next is not just words. It is activation. It is unlocking. It is transfer. I now enter into agreement with what heaven has already decided. In the name of Jesus, I do not pray from lack. I pray from alignment. I decree that every invisible resistance operating against this life loses its power now. Everything that tried to delay, confuse, drain, or divert is disauthorized at this moment. I decree that old cycles are closed with clarity and authority. Nothing from the past has the power to define the next steps anymore. What did not keep pace with the growth of the Spirit is left behind without negotiation. I decree the opening of paths where there was once blockage. I decree clarity where there was confusion. I decreed advancement where there was stagnation. Let doors that were sealed by fear, doubt, or emotional exhaustion open now. Let the right connections align. Let resources find the right path. Let opportunities recognize this life by name. I decree that the Spirit takes governance again. The mind grows quiet, the soul aligns, and the body responds to a new rhythm. Everything that was misaligned returns to its proper axis. Everything held beyond its time begins to move. Everything that seemed distant enters a route of manifestation. I decree that this person no longer walks by effort, but by direction, no longer reacts by anxiety, but responds with discernment. May favor reach places where their feet have not yet arrived. May right decisions become light. May difficult choices become clear. May courage speak before fear has a chance. I decree the breaking of patterns of scarcity. Let every limiting mindset be replaced with an awareness of inheritance. Let provision come with purpose. Let abundance come with responsibility. Let access come with maturity. Nothing will be wasted. Nothing will be delayed. Nothing will be stolen. I decree that this life enters a cycle of continuous advancement, a cycle where doors open without exhaustion, where answers arrive at the right time, where the invisible begins to become visible. May peace govern decisions. May courage govern steps. May clarity govern the future. I decree complete alignment between identity, purpose, and destiny. May everything God has written find space to manifest. May what was prepared in silence be revealed at the appointed time. Now, receive. Receive renewed strength. Receive expanded vision. Receive clear strategy. Receive legitimate access. Receive advancement without retreat. May this person be guarded in their paths, firm in their decisions, and sensitive to direction. May nothing remove them from the route. May nothing distract them from what matters. May nothing paralyze them again. I seal this moment with spiritual authority. What was decreed remains. What was activated advances. What was aligned will not be lost. And may the coming days bring confirmation, not confusion, movement, not stagnation, advancement, not empty waiting. May you be blessed in your thoughts, your choices, and your paths. May peace accompany your steps. May favor find you where you least expect it. Amen, amen, amen. And if this content spoke to you, if this atmosphere strengthens and positions you, subscribe to the channel to continue walking in this same environment of clarity, direction, and activation. Here, every word carries purpose, and you do not walk alone.